John Laughland, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Hi, Jerm.
You and I have chatted plenty over the last few years, but this is for my UK column audience. For those who don't know who you are, John, very, very briefly, what is your background?
So I'm currently an academic. I teach political science in a small private university in the west of France. I live in Paris. I commute there for 2 days a week, and I also work as director of Forum for Democracy International, Forum for Democracy being a Dutch political party run by our mutual friend Thierry Baudet. So I have those two quivers to my bow, and before that I wrote a number of books. The one that's probably best known is a one I wrote in the 90s on the European Union called The Tainted Source, The Undemocratic Origins of the European Idea. But since that, I've written a lot about Eastern Europe and done a lot of work on relations between East and West, and obviously, therefore, with Russia.
And let's not forget that you and I co-host a Wednesday panel discussion. We've been doing it for a couple of years now, haven't we?
Which we do for essentially for FVD International. We call it the Forum, and I'm very delighted and honoured to have you as a co-host.
Well, the feeling is mutual, John. Now, you're in France, you're obviously British, but the situation across Europe is very much the same. The elephant in the room is the mass immigration crisis. It is a crisis, is it not?
Yeah, but I don't think it's an elephant in the room, because I think it is being talked about now after many decades. It's discussed and it's recognized as a crisis, I would say, in all European countries at the moment, in France, in Germany, and even in Britain, where the Prime Minister Keir Starmer made a very surprising speech some weeks ago in which he said we'd become a country of strangers or an island of strangers or something. And the scale, of course, of the problem is absolutely gigantic. I mean, I think this is, in a way, I suppose the word crisis implies a sort of sudden event, which a sudden high-intensity event. But unfortunately, this immigration problem has been going on for decades. It's been going on since at least the mid-1990s in Europe, when the European Union, most European Union countries abolished internal border controls, the famous Schengen Agreement. So now, if you're in the Schengen area, which extends from the Black Sea in Romania to the English Channel, because every country, including, by the way, Switzerland, in between, has abolished its internal border controls. This means, of course, that you only have to land in Lampedusa, which is an island, an Italian island, not very far from the coast of Libya, or cross let's say, the Bulgarian-Turkish border to enter the Schengen space. And you can automatically go wherever you like, all over Europe, without much fear of being checked. You certainly won't be checked on a border. And that agreement, which was signed in the mid-90s, had an instant effect. When I say instant, I myself, in the, I think, late 90s, so there's a couple of years afterwards, visited the refugee camp in Calais. So Calais is obviously opposite, everyone listening knows where Calais is. It's opposite Dover on the other side of the English Channel in France. And there was a refugee camp, or at least a Red Cross camp there, from the mid-late 90s onwards. Why? Because people, as I say, could cross the Mediterranean, they could land in Lampedusa, or they could come through the Balkans, from God knows where, from the Middle East, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, literally from all over the world. And they could travel across, as I say, the whole Schengen space. And if they wanted to come to Britain, they could stow away in lorries, or more recently cross the channel in little inflatable dinghies. Well, little, I mean, they carry about 20 or 30 people, I think. I mentioned this visit that I made to the camp, which was then in a little suburb of Calais called Sangatte, because it underlines how long this has been going on for. That's why, as I say, I'm not sure the word crisis is right. The increase has been spectacular in Britain, but even before this latest increase in the last couple of years, the figures have been absolutely catastrophic. So when I talk about an increase, I think, again, I'm sure many of our listeners will know that the net arrivals in Britain in, I think, 2023, so the last year of the Conservative government, were 1.4 million. I don't have to hand the figures for 2024, under which when Labour took power, but they are absolutely gigantic. You know, this is a large city arriving. This is like the city of Birmingham or something, arriving every year, because prior to the figures, which went well over a million and reached, as I say, 1.4 million in 2023, the figures were still were already at 500,000 or 600,000 a year, every year, for about a quarter of a century, since, as I say, since the mid to late 90s and throughout the 2000s and 2010s. So Britain, for, let's say, for the last 25 years, we're in 2025, has been accepting hundreds of thousands, 500,000, let's say, every year. Of course, people leave as well. That's not the net figure, but the net figure is still very, very high. It's still in the hundreds of thousands. And this has been going on, as I say, for a quarter of a century. And there's a second reason as well why I think the word crisis is wrong, because this is an industry. This is industrially organized, this illegal migration. Each migrant pays a considerable sum, several thousand, many thousands of dollars, to get to their destination. It requires considerable logistics. Obviously, you have to be smuggled across the external Schengen border. That presumably involves bribery, or at least some kind of operation getting people across a border, if there's a physical border. Then it requires, obviously, transport to be arranged over, hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Firstly, to get to the Schengen space and within it. And then, of course, it requires these dinghies to be brought across if they're coming to Britain, or other forms of stowaway. Of course, there are thousands and thousands of lorries which cross over the channel every day, every hour. And I myself have seen migrants climbing into the back of these lorries. And indeed, I mentioned the Sangatte camp in the late 90s, but much later on, I think in the 2010s, there was a gigantic camp. Gigantic. It wasn't even a Red Cross camp. It was just like a shanty town near the ferry terminal in Calais itself. Absolutely gigantic. It was called the Jungle until it was cleared out. And when you drove to Calais to take the ferry to Britain, you would see all over the place Africans, black Africans mainly, but also, as I say, people from the Middle East, Central Asia, and so on, wandering around, basically trying to get onto lorries, and now, as we know, more onto boats. Anyway, all this requires organisation. Now, I'm not saying there's obviously not one organisation. I assume there are many, many different mafia groups, many human trafficking groups, but it requires very substantial organisation, and it requires, of course, at the receiving end, economic interest. There must be economics driving this. So obviously the migrants, again, in the case of Britain, they are coming to Britain because they will be housed, they will be given free healthcare and all the rest of it, and they can work. So they have an economic interest. Very obviously, they don't come, as far as I know, to live off benefits, although, of course, that's also a problem. Certainly in other parts of Europe, that's a problem. They probably come to work. But there must, as I say, on the receiving side, be very substantial economic interests. Otherwise, the scale of this would not have reached the figures that it has. And when I say economic interests, I am, without knowing exactly the answer, because I'm not a specialist on this, I suspect that the economic, apart from the obvious economic interest of having a constant stream of cheap labour, which is in the economic interests of some sectors of the economy. I'm not convinced, far from it, that it's good for the economy as a whole. But clearly, if you can get more and more people pouring out of Somalia or Pakistan or Afghanistan or wherever, then you can obviously keep wages down. But I suspect that there are much more sinister economic interests. I imagine that a large section of this immigration is being driven by organised crime. We know that the transport is organised crime, but I expect that once they've reached their destination, they are there for, I imagine, some percentage, I don't know what percentage, to deal in, I don't know, drugs or whatever, prostitution, that kind of thing. And similarly, and this is a further level of speculation for which I'm afraid I don't have proof, but it seems to me to stand to reason, that there must be big financial interests as well. Because again, this is a problem that goes back many decades. If you have got a large sector of criminal activity, whatever it is, drugs or whatever, that money has to go somewhere. The money has to be washed through the system, and I assume. I mean, it's a speculation, but it's not. Of course, it's based on other things I know. That there is an interest, at least for the financial sector, in having this money washed back into the system. Through various money laundering operations, including shops and whatever else. So, as I say, I think it's the word crisis doesn't really give us a feeling of the scale, because on the contrary, this is an industrially organized transfer of population. And it is organized both at the sending end and also at the receiving end. And there are, of course, interests involved, big interests involved at all stages. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we know that the people arriving are not refugees in the legal sense of the word. The United Nations Refugee Convention has been a dead letter now for ages. It provides that if there's a war, then the neighbouring countries should have some sort of obligation to accept people from there and try and house them or whatever. But as I've said, and as everybody knows, these people are crossing very great numbers of safe countries in order to get to their destination. And it's obvious that if some Afghan or something ends up in Calais, he is safe in Calais. He's obviously, in a legal sense, no longer a refugee. And by the way, we know from others who have studied this much more closely than I have, that the largest numbers of countries providing immigrants into Britain, if we take Britain, from memory, I think those countries are Nigeria and Pakistan. There isn't a war in Nigeria. There isn't a war in Pakistan. There's no sense that these people are fleeing any kind of conflict. On the contrary, they are economic migrants. It's economic mass migration.
But there is something odd going on, John, because a significant percentage of those migrants come from Africa. Now, I'm also African. I guess my own identity is a conversation on its own. I'm not European, but I have European ancestry. So I guess for the time being, you could claim that I am African. And when I visited you a couple of years ago, the amount of red tape that I had to go through just to get into Europe was probably the worst that I've ever experienced in all my travels around the world. It was the toughest place to enter. Yet other Africans are getting in very easily. So something doesn't add up.
Well, they are obviously coming in illegally. And when you came a couple of years ago, I joked and said you should have come by boat from Libya because you'd have been able to get here much more easily. They are clearly illegal migrants. And again, this takes us back to the organized and indeed, let's say, sponsored, possibly even state-sponsored, or at least certainly tolerated nature of this gigantic industrial operation. There are, in France, where I'm speaking to you from, I again, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact figures, but I don't think I'm wildly wrong if I say there are 1 million people in France who probably should not be here, who are here illegally. The British complain that the French police don't round up the illegal immigrants in Calais. Well, that's a fair point. But on the other hand, as I say, if the total number on the whole of the territory of France is 1 million, then it's effectively impossible to remove so many people, or at least it would be a very, very difficult operation to imagine. So my conviction is that there is some sort of tolerance, if not encouragement, on the part of states. I mean, again, in Britain, it's not difficult to see that there is such tolerance, because if you arrive in a dinghy crossing the channel, you are immediately taken into a reception centre and then put into a hotel. That is paid for by the state, obviously. So there is clearly a level of state sponsoring or encouragement of this. And then even illegal migrants are effectively allowed to work. And they are also, of course, given handouts. So the states are encouraging this. Yes, there's no doubt about it. And I think they're encouraging it. It's not clear to me why exactly. But again, I think it's part of the thing I indicated a moment ago. Big financial interests are involved. Money is involved. Money is washed through the system. That itself generates further income. And the state, in one way or another, is involved in that. Whether it's through corruption or ideology, I don't know. But there is no doubt, I haven't made this point yet, but there is no doubt that there is, of course, an ideology of immigration. Immigration is supported ideologically by states. We've had decades of anti-racism in all European countries, state-sponsored anti-racism. Racism and prejudice against migrants is considered to be the greatest possible sin. And huge campaigns have been waged against it. Political parties have been kept out of power. They still are being kept out of power in Europe, all over Europe, for that very reason. And that is state-driven. That is state-driven, and that is ideologically driven. And the ideology is, well, there are various aspects to it. Again, it's such a big phenomenon that you can't summarize it in one quick sentence, but there is plenty of evidence, more than evidence. There are plenty of people who say that migration is needed. Lots of big companies say it, but lots of states say it as well, needed to pay the pensions. The idea that if you have a falling birth rate or a low birth rate, you need to keep the demographic pyramid the right way up in order to, and you can only do that by migration if people aren't having enough children. It's widely argued at the highest level of politics that that's necessary for the overall health of society. And then, of course, you have the more, let's say, a bit more sinister ideology, which is part of the anti-racism and is the ideology that, a black African and a Dutchman are interchangeable. This is the liberal ideal, that you have, if someone arrives from Nigeria, he can essentially do the same job and have the same economic and social functionality as, a Frenchman or a Dutchman or whatever. And that's part of the, I would say, I suppose, globalist post-national ideology, which obviously is dominant in all across Europe at the highest political level, and frankly also in Britain.
Just on that, I watched, I don't know, last year I think it was, just a little bit of Eurovision, which is the largest music thing in the world. What do you call it? Festival? I don't know, music competition. It blew my mind how many of them did not look like they come from those countries.
Yeah. Well, I mean, soccer, I think, is special because, of course, the players in these big teams are paid. It's not an amateur sport. And, well, to put it very bluntly, the black Africans are very athletic, and they are probably better football players than the whites. So they get recruited. So that's not that's not quite so much a demographic phenomenon as a financial one. Eurovision, I don't know. Eurovision is highly political, so it could well be that, again, the national teams put forward people from migrant backgrounds in order to, increase their own kudos or whatever. But of course, there's no doubt that there is a demographic impact. I said at the beginning of in answer to your first question, this has been going on for 25 years now. So, a young man who arrived 25 years ago is now, well into middle age, and therefore he's now 45 or whatever, 45 or 50. So of course these things percolate through, and you can see it again in all countries. You can see it in Britain, in the political class. You can see there are plenty of Indian and African origin members of parliament, ministers, and so on. You see the same phenomenon across Europe. That's inevitable when you have, as I say, the equivalent of one large city arriving in your country every year. Then obviously that will eventually be visible, both in public life and indeed on the streets, as of course it is in places like London and other big cities, all of which Birmingham, Manchester, and so on, are now all the big cities in the United Kingdom, as Nigel Farage pointed out at least a year ago, are in fact now majority migrant. We've had statistics on this again for decades. When I last lived in London in the 2000s, already by then, the census showed that white British, that's one of the categories, was a minority. And when the period I'm talking about, we were 48%. Now, 20 years on, I think it's gone down to 38% or something like that.
But it obviously brings up a few philosophical discussions around what it means to be of that nation. So I'm a South African. If you had to ask me what is a South African, I can't answer that question anymore. I don't know I genuinely don't know the answer. Similarly, what does it mean then to be British?
Well, I think you've put your finger on it, but I think it's very different, of course, for South Africa, because South Africa is a new country dating from the beginning of the 20th century, whereas France and Britain are very ancient countries and have existed for, 1,000 years and more. And there's no doubt that those countries, to put it again very bluntly, have an ethnic base or had an ethnic base. But of course, this has been taboo now. It's been taboo to say this in Europe for decades. But to me, it's obvious that nations do have an ethnic base. The very word nation comes from the word to be born. It implies where you are born. So if you have coming into the country people who were born somewhere else, then the characteristic, the composition of the nation changes. And again, I mentioned ideology. For decades in Britain, we've had a political discourse about British values, and that migrants are supposed to embrace and acquiesce in British values. Well, firstly, it's not very clear what these British values are. Secondly, nations, as I say, are not created out of values; they're created out of ethnicity. So you have the word England comes from a very, very ancient pre-Norman conquest people, the Angles. It's the land of the Angles. The Angles are a first millennium people. That's what defines the country, the people who live in it. In all countries now, particularly in Britain and France, indeed, you've had for decades this officially sponsored notion that the nation, the state and the nation can continue to exist as it did before, even with these industrial levels of immigration. And I believe that they can't. I don't believe the same nation. If in London, if it's only 38% of the people are white British, if in the capital of the country the indigenous people are in a minority, that to me is very, very serious, very, very serious. It's serious for all kinds of reasons. But to say that it can somehow be all laundered through values, to me is quite wrong, because I think that ethnicity does count. Of course, it's not the only thing that matters in the world, but I think it does count. And I think that the problems from which all European societies currently suffer are, to some extent, a matter of ethnicity. So, for example, we talk about again. I don't think any of your viewers, any of our viewers, will be. I hope they won't be shocked. But I mean, there are substantial numbers of Chinese immigrants all over the world. China is a very big country. There are plenty of Chinese people in Britain, but they generally slip under the radar because, indeed, they are not socially, generally speaking, a problem. It's as simple as that.
Just to add to what you were saying, if I said Zulu, you immediately know what I'm talking about. You're not thinking of a white person because you don't really get white Zulus. It's a nation. And as it happens, the nation tends to congregate in a specific part of South Africa, just by its own desire. Now, this you would see happening all over the world, excepting when it becomes artificially induced.
Well, I mean, I believe, but again, without being a specialist, that ethnicity continues to play a role similar to the one you've described. Look, I don't have figures to hand, and maybe I'm wrong, but there surely must be sociologists who've worked on this. We know that let's take the Indian population of Britain, the population of Britain that comes from the Indian subcontinent. It seems to me, looking at it from some distance, that it's very common for people from Indian origin, even if they're born in Britain and are essentially British, legally speaking, it's very common for them to marry other Indians and to start families with other Indians. Again, I don't have the figures, but the previous Prime Minister was born in Britain, Rishi Sunak, but married in India and married an Indian wife. And I think this is quite common. And that's an example of how ethnicity continues, even in the structures of a very substantial state like Britain. South Africa, I think, as far as I can tell, is a much weaker state. It's a more recent creation. It doesn't have the same homogeneity. Obviously, it doesn't have any homogeneity, as far as I can tell, ethnic. But even in a case like Britain, which theoretically should have a national culture, legal and moral and political culture, and of course does have, one would expect in those circumstances for there to be a great melting pot. But in fact, as we know also, by the way, from the United States of America, people do group together by ethnicity. Not everybody, of course, but largely speaking, they do. And that, again, to me, is a basic anthropological fact. It's not discriminatory. It's not condemnatory. It's, on the contrary, a description of what seems to me to be human nature.
I was just thinking now as you were talking, as we are having this discussion, we are very clearly walking on tiptoes through a minefield. And I'm trying to figure out, John, why.
Well, because of the ideology of political correctness. The anti-racism has been so intense that indeed, you're right, one has to choose one's word very carefully and sort of hedge everything round with all kinds of qualifications and perhaps not say everything that one is thinking. We all, I'm afraid, we do live under a very restrictive regime. We also, I suppose, we're polite and we don't want to be rude about other people. There may be other factors as well, but there has been, and that's why I say that the states are themselves involved, there has been a massive campaign of vilification. Ever in Britain, everyone knows Enoch Powell's famous speech, which, if I'm not mistaken, was already even in the late 1960s. I've forgotten the date of the speech. That's usually referred to wrongly as rivers of blood. He didn't say rivers of blood. It was, on the contrary, an image from ancient Roman literature that he was using. But anyway, that speech, if I'm not mistaken, was from the 1960s when immigration had already started, of course, on a much lower scale than it is now. But we're dealing with a phenomenon that's been going on forever. And he famously was sacked from the cabinet, because I think he was a cabinet minister at that time, and then expelled from the Conservative Conservative Party and has been demonized ever since, as have all other politicians going up to today who campaign against immigration. They are all demonized. Jean-Marie Le Pen in France was demonized for decades, and even now the anti-immigrant parties are by and large demonized and excluded from power. In Germany, the AfD, the various states in Germany, there are one or two. There's I think it was. I forget in which state, one of the states in West Germany has announced that no member of the AfD party can work in the state administration. There are repeated threats to ban the party, even though, of course, it takes part in elections. So the pressure is gigantic. In Austria, the anti-immigrant party won the last elections, but has been excluded from office by a coalition of the losers, and on and on and on. You know, there are some countries where the anti-immigrant party has managed to gain power. The case of the Netherlands is very interesting because in the 2023 elections, the anti-immigrant, or more precisely anti-Islam party of Geert Wilders was the winner and formed the government, albeit without the party leader Wilders as a minister. And in the year in which they governed, the government collapsed a few weeks ago. The numbers of people arriving in the Netherlands has continued at the level of well over 100,000. In other words, well over the population of a major city like, I believe, Maastricht. Or yes, Maastricht, I think, has a population of about the number of people who arrived last year under the watch of this supposedly anti-immigrant government. And that, by the way, also shows, it's not directly connected to the question of immigration, but it also shows, and of course we saw this in the first Trump administration, not specifically on the question of immigration, but it also shows how difficult it is to govern countries and how deeply embedded inertia is, how deeply embedded the deep state is, and how difficult it is, even for elected officials with a clear mandate, to turn things around.
So is there a disconnect between, say, the EU and Europeans?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the EU is disconnected from Europeans structurally and on all other issues. But of course, on this immigration issue, yes. But the disconnect is also clear at national level. Because, as I've said, in most countries, the anti-immigrant political parties are excluded or at least demonized. The only partial exceptions to this have been the Netherlands and Austria, which have had the anti-immigrant party in power for brief periods without much to show for it. But yes, the EU is structurally disconnected from Europe. But again, it's not, I'm a very strong critic of the EU, but this is a problem that cannot, unfortunately, be blamed only on the European Union. It's a problem that is very deeply embedded at the state level as well, at national level as well.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about illegal immigrants just coming in large numbers into Europe, but China doesn't have this problem. So what is happening at the border of each of these territories then?
Well, as I say, within the Schengen space, there are no borders. There are no physical borders. So if you're in Romania or Bulgaria, you can go to Sweden without being asked to show your passport. What happens on the external border? I suspect, well, firstly, I imagine there's corruption. I imagine that you bribe a border guard or whatever. Secondly, we know that there is a whole apparatus of non-governmental organizations, very often, by the way, funded by states. Again, this is a big scandal, but it's well in the public domain, who bring migrants, they fish them out. When I say fish, I don't mean that they've drowned or whatever, but they collect them. This has been going on for years. I'm sure people listening to us know about this. They certainly should. These non-governmental organizations sail close to the Libyan coast. They find a dinghy. They put the people from the dinghy onto a proper ship, and they bring them over to Italy. So that's been part of the thing. And these NGOs, many of which, as I say, are funded by states, then continue their action. For example, preventing deportations. So you have this, again, it's one of these big structural issues, which for some reason seems to be very difficult to dismantle, whereby this is the case in France, for example, but I'm sure it's the case in many other European countries. The state funds non-governmental organizations whose principal activity is to stick spokes in the wheels of what the state is doing. So, for example, to give legal aid to people who are contesting their deportation order. This is one of the crazy things. These organizations are generally state-funded. So, the answer to your question is multiple. And again, famously, these things, I hope our listeners and viewers know this, but the head, or at least a senior figure in the European Union's border organization, Frontex, resigned a year or two ago and then stood as a candidate, and I believe has now been elected to the European Parliament, because when he took office, he said, right, let's really sort this illegal immigration out. Let's make Frontex do what it was supposed to do. And he was told quite specifically by, I believe, the European Commissioner involved in immigration that this was absolutely not what was going to happen. And on the contrary, Frontex was just a smokescreen to essentially permit, or maybe even encourage, mass migration for the reasons I've given. The argument, the immigrationist lobby is very powerful with economic and ideological arguments.
No discussion about the fall of Europe can be had unless we also bring in a fundamental aspect of Europe, and that is Christianity. My wife asked me a very interesting question the other day. She asked me if I think the implosion of Europe has anything to do with perhaps the decrease in Christianity, the rise in atheism. The Church of England, which is effectively the largest head of Protestant Christianity worldwide, doesn't seem to be doing much. You know something about the Vatican. Do you think the Vatican's doing anything?
Well, firstly, it's not strictly speaking correct to ask about the Vatican, because the Catholic Church, yes, of course, the papacy ultimately appoints bishops and so on, and has considerable power. But again, it's a bit like your question about the European Union. The problem is also at the level of bishops in all the various different countries. But since you do ask about the Vatican, I think it's worth remarking on the fact that the last two, the present Pope and the previous Pope, have of course not been Europeans, and this is an important phenomenon, if only on the symbolic level, because whereas for 2,000 years popes were always Europeans, and indeed for many, many, many centuries they were Italians. That stopped, of course, with John Paul II, the first Polish pope, and then since then there hasn't been an Italian. But now the papacy of Leo XIV and of Pope Francis before him have symbolized the fact that the Catholic Church is, of course, a very, very substantial worldwide organization with enormous rises, I believe, or certainly increases in religious observance in what we call the third world, so in Africa, for example, and in Latin America, and therefore not in Europe. And so the focus of the Vatican, of the papacy, is indeed much, much wider than Europe. And for that matter, the previous pope seemed to have a certain contempt for Europe. As a matter of fact, he certainly didn't defend when he went once to, I think, Lampedusa. He brought back in his plane a number of migrants, and they were all Muslims, and obviously they were not Europeans, obviously by definition. So what is the connection with Christianity? These are very, very big questions. There's a very well-known French sociologist, Emmanuel Todd, who is very widely regarded in France. He's mainly famous for having published in the 1980s a book saying that the Soviet Union would collapse, a prediction that he was able to make because he could see the declining birth rates in the Soviet Union. Many statistics in the Soviet Union were falsified, but it's very difficult to falsify demographic statistics. And he looked at these and concluded that something was very badly wrong. And he's since published a number of other books, always with a demographic angle. And his most recent book is called The Defeat of the West. And in that book, he talks about all kinds of things. He talks about the war in Ukraine. He talks about disindustrialization. But he has a very arresting chapter on what he calls nihilism. Western or specifically European nihilism. And what he means, he is not a religious man at all. He is an old-fashioned liberal, left liberal, ultimately, Emmanuel Todd, very brilliant, but absolutely not, on a sort of some sort of right-wing conservative trajectory. On the contrary, but he, as I say, as a non-believing person, has identified from a sociological point of view the collapse of Christian observance in Europe. And he talks about various stages. He talks about zombie Christianity, by which he meant that people would get married in church and that they would go to funerals with a priest and so on, but they didn't practice in any real sense. But then, nonetheless, the church still, if you like, marked the sort of the great moments in life and death. And he says we've gone beyond that in Europe. We've gone beyond zombie Christianity to zero Christianity, and to what he, as I say, calls nihilism. And I, who am a philosopher, who studied philosophy, I find this remark about nihilism absolutely fascinating. He doesn't actually develop it very far, but it's quite clear that he knows what he's talking about. He's understood the problem. And in an interview I saw of him, I've read the book. Unfortunately, I think I gave my copy to someone, possibly even to Thierry, actually. So I haven't been able to recheck the book. But in an interview he gave, he said, what do I mean by nihilism? Well, what I mean is that people do not know, I'm quoting him, why they are on Earth. They don't know why they're here. And that's really a very good way of describing it, actually. People don't know. I mean, in a way, I suppose none of us knows, but they don't even ask. They don't even think. They don't have any. There's no reflection, if you like. It's regarded. That's why he talks about it being zero Christianity. And the reason why I'm mentioning this, it's a rather a long answer, but is that, as I say, he links this to the overall decline and ultimately postulates it as the root cause of the decline. And I think he has identified, albeit as a sociologist, not as a theologian, something which to me is absolutely obvious. I remember, by the way, more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, hearing Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, in a big political speech say that our adversaries have spiritual values, and that's what makes them strong. They have, and he was, I imagine, referring mainly to the Muslim world. And I think that's right. I think if populations cease to have any spiritual dimensions, I'm not trying to sound slushy or touchy-feely or whatever, but if they do not know why they are on Earth, if they do not think that their life has any real greater meaning other than whatever consumption or then it seems to me obvious that they will be weak in all kinds of other areas. Strength comes from a belief in transcendence, and if that belief disappears, if that belief also in the future and in the ongoing future generations and so on, if that all vanishes, as it seems to have done, then I think our societies are fatally weakened. So I encourage people. Unfortunately, I don't know if the book is translated. I don't think it's translated into English, so it'll be difficult for them to read The Defeat of the West, La Défaite de l'Occident. But it's a remarkable book, and indeed, I would like to, if I find the time, I would like to develop this theme from a more philosophical and even theological perspective. I'm not going to promise anything because I've got more unwritten books on my computer than I care to admit to. But I gave a lecture about it recently, and that's something I'd like to start working on a bit more myself.
I must just apologize. I have recorded this entire conversation using the wrong microphone. So I will do a whole lot of editing afterwards to make me sound better. I've been clearing my throat, and I just realized now that would have been off-putting. I've got a frog in my throat throughout this entire conversation. So my apologies, John.
It's okay. I didn't hear it, but I too have been coughing from, I think, pollen or something.
When I was in Europe a couple of years ago, I noticed there were a lot of churches and cathedrals that were just empty.
Well, that's right. And I mean, it depends. I think there is some variation. France, oddly enough, there is a certain growth at the moment. People have remarked on an increase in the number of adult baptisms. quite significant percentages. I've forgotten the figures, but I think 20% increase on the previous year. But the absolute figures are very low, so we're only dealing with a few tens of thousands of people. But yes, broadly speaking, you're quite right. And I've indicated in the answer to your last question that my belief that nihilism, if that's what it is, zero Christianity, zero thinking about the transcendent, about the afterlife, about your soul, about all these theological issues, that is, in my view, a source of weakness nationally that can only translate into weakness, it seems to me. But I'm sure that many of our listeners will agree to me that just on a basic sociological level, I mean, of course, going to church is not a social activity, it's a religious activity, but it also has a social dimension. People chat as they're leaving the church service. They know each other, they form a little community and so on. And yes, if the churches are empty, as they are in large parts of Europe, and of course, in some countries, the decline has been absolutely spectacular. I'm thinking of Ireland, for example. Ireland, which used to export priests to the entire world, now has almost no seminarians left at all, and its churches are also largely emptying out. I think I'd like to say one extra thing, which may sound a bit crazy, but unfortunately, where I think Emmanuel Todd is wrong, and again, I apologize because I'm not an expert on this and I haven't worked on it properly, is that he doesn't, not being a theologian and not being a man of faith, he perhaps doesn't see the worst consequences of this zero. And the worst consequences are that nature abhors a vacuum and that other things fill the void of nihilism. There are Satanists, there are people who are into really kooky stuff, in America famously, but I think also in Britain. And that aspect to me is absolutely terrifying. Again, I don't know what kind of levels we're talking about, but there is no doubt that exists. I'm sure it's very small and so on. But there are people who, as I say, are into very, very strange beliefs indeed.
While the churches are empty, mosques are filling up.
Yes. Yes. Well, again, that's the story, isn't it, of the last quarter of a century. Islam has been growing now for at least a quarter of a century, both in its countries of origin and in countries where there are Muslim immigrants. When I say countries of origin, you look at Turkey, for example. Turkey, as far as I know, is a much more Muslim country, much more Islamic country than it was a couple of generations ago. The Balkans, which I know a bit better, religious observance has increased there. And this, by the way, of course, brings us back to the question of immigration, because one of the factors driving Muslim religious observance, and one of the factors driving other very unpleasant phenomena associated with immigration, I'm thinking of sexual harassment and rape and sex crimes and so on, and more generally the sort of the sociological problems associated with certain immigrant groups, crime, ghettoization, and so on. These things are connected because that's why when I referred a moment ago to British values, I think everybody understood I was, there were inverted commas around my use of the word. Once again, nature abhors a vacuum. And if you are from an immigrant background, your parents or grandparents are from wherever, North Africa or the Middle East or whatever, that is part of your identity. It's part of your, it's very difficult to, most people don't want, why would they? Why should they? They don't want to abandon their ethnic identity. We all know the phenomenon of adopted children. They want to find out who their real parents are. Those people know that they have another identity. They are interested in it. It gives them, it's special. It's part of their physical composition. But if they are in a society which is completely nihilistic, and they come from a society which has some sense of cohesion and values or whatever, in this case, let's say through Islam, then their attitude towards the society which they find themselves in will become one of contempt and anger and frustration and alienation. And that, I think, is very definitely one of the problems associated with migration. It both explains the rise in Muslim observance in countries, so in Europe, and it also explains the hostility. Of course, again, obviously this is not the majority, but there is, we all know, the Islamist movement and so on. There have been plenty of Islamic attacks, terrorist attacks in Europe over recent decades. We've only just recently celebrated or commemorated 20 years since the horrible attacks in London in 2005. These things are part of a cycle. So if the society is nihilistic, then religious observance increases on the other side, in this case on the Muslim side, and so does hatred. So can hatred for the society in question, contempt and hatred.
Douglas Murray wrote a book a few years ago, you might remember, The Strange Death of Europe. Very good read, I found. So Europe is clearly on life support. Is it able to recover?
It's not absolutely clear. I mean, I hesitate to say no, it can't recover, but only because of looking at history over the very long stretch. Countries, my feeling is that countries don't completely disappear. They can degrade, they can go down a very long way, but they don't completely disappear. I mean, if we take Russia, for example, Russia had 70 years of communism. It was in a terrible state at the end of the 1980s, and then throughout into the 1990s. And yet that country undoubtedly has recovered absolutely spectacularly. Not all problems, of course, have been solved, but there's really no comparison between Russia in 1991 and Russia today. On the contrary, it's a prosperous country with a lot of economic growth and all the rest of it. And also, I believe, some favorable demographic tendencies. So I'm hesitant to say that it can completely that Europe can completely disappear. Also, because I think it might vary. So France, for instance, might be slightly less bad in some ways than Germany, for example, or Italy or whatever. But yes, I think the situation is exceptionally grave. The immigration issue that we started off is a problem that won't go away. There are a few groups talking about remigration. They want to encourage people to go back to their countries of origin. They want to change the benefit system so that there's less incentive for people from migrant backgrounds to stay, and so on. This is a very minority view, and it's never been tried. And even if these people were able to get into power, would it work, and so on? That's a structural problem. That's a physical problem. This presence of a huge foreign population on your territory. And then the other structural problem, which I think makes the outlook for Europe very, very bleak indeed, is of course debt. We haven't talked about this, but all the Western countries and all the European countries are massively in debt. Massively in debt. They are in debt to levels that they will never be able to repay. The French debt has increased by 1,000 billion under Emmanuel Macron, by 30%, from 2 trillion to 3 trillion. These are figures that are almost impossible to imagine, really. And of course, that means that that's taxation for many generations ahead that will have to pay for that debt. And it essentially means deferred taxation for future generations or inflation of the currency, both of which are catastrophic for the future. So I'm afraid the outlook is extremely bleak, and I don't really know what Europe can do about it.
John, you're such a ray of sunshine. I was hoping for something positive to end the conversation on.
Well, I've mentioned these sort of figures in France where I live. So there are here and there little inflections, little positive points. There have been, on the immigration question, Farage in Britain seems to be doing well. It's difficult to see how long the cordon sanitaire can hold against these right-wing anti-immigrant parties, or at least anti-immigrant parties. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. The Dutch experience has been extremely disappointing. The Austrian and German and French examples are not encouraging. I think the French political system will manage to regenerate itself. I don't see a victory for the anti-immigrant party here in France. So I think we have to be realistic. And I also think, again, this is one of Thierry Baudet's big points, and I heard him say it again in Vienna last week. Is that change doesn't come from politics. Again, the Dutch example shows this. Politics has only very limited capacities for effecting political change. Instead, political change comes from bigger things, the kind of things that I mentioned at the beginning, financial interests, economic interests, and so on. And of course, ideology, education, cultural hegemony, and so on. And there is, I'm afraid, a huge amount of work to do in all those areas.
Would you say that politics is downstream from culture?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm lucky to teach in a university where we have freedom and where there is no ideology, there's no, political correctness or whatever. But we are, we have 2,000 students out of, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of students there are in the whole of France. It's a very minor phenomenon, and indeed probably a unique one in the whole of Europe. So unfortunately, the challenges in the cultural area are gigantic as well.
How can my UK column audience follow either you or FVD?
Yeah, so the main one would be fvdinternational.com, which is our webpage, but also we have obviously an X channel, FVD_INTL, and my own one, which from memory is John_Laughland. On X. So those would be the main places. And we're also on things like Instagram as well. We have the weekly show that I do with you, the forum, which is on our webpage and also, of course, on X, but also on all the other platforms.
Just for clarity, FVD, not FED.
FVD. V is the Dutch for Forum for Democracy. We kept the Dutch acronym because that's how political parties are referred to in the Netherlands. So FVD.
John Laughland, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you, Jerm. It's great talking to you. All the best.